Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the House Committee on Environment and Energy. We are going to be talking about a proposed amendment, considering adding to S 112. And our vice chair has done a lot of work to bring this idea together, and we do not have our Ledge Council with us right at this moment. So I ask her to orient us and walk us through it.
Thanks, Madam Chair. We have been having ongoing discussions with our electric utilities, with our renewable energy industry and our environmental community about the renewable energy standard in Vermont, which is a performance standard for our electric sector, about examining how that's working and contemplating changes. We've got several bills up on our wall, and we have run out of time to work on that this year and have brought those folks together, the stakeholders together, to talk about how to bring forward language next year through a legislatively led working group with support from the Joint Fiscal Office in conjunction with the work that is ongoing from the Department of Public Service, with the goal of bringing in draft legislation. So do you want me to just go through the aspects of the bill? Okay, great.
You don't have to, read it, but
Okay. So this, I'll go from here. It will, it's a legislative working group on renewable energy standard reform. The purpose is that it is being created for is to draft legislation to be considered by the General Assembly during the 2024 session. It will be convened by 2 members from the House, appointed by the Speaker, 2 members from the Senate, appointed by committee and committees. Additional membership will include 1 representative from GMP, Burlington Electric, IPSA, Washington Electric, Vermont Electric Co-op, VPERG, Renewable Energy Vermont, Conservation and Law Foundation, VELCO, the Vermont Housing and Finance Agency, the Vermont Natural Resources Council, and the Sierra Club. Stowe and Hyde Park utilities may name a representative if they choose. They are not part of this. In addition to submitting draft legislation, the working group shall report on the following items: whether or not any changes to Vermont's existing renewable energy requirements are needed to increase grid stability, resilience, modernization, and reliability. Any barriers to moving to a 100% renewable standard for all electric utilities by 2030. Recommended cost-effective procurement policies to increase new renewable energy and storage, to offset increasing in-state load, improve grid stability and resilience, and factor into IRP electric load growth projections. If increasing the requirements for out-of-state renewable procurements within and delivered into the ISO New England territory can help ensure affordable electric rates, to evaluate the impact legislative recommendations may have on Tier 3 implementation. Tier 3 in the res has to do with thermal load. Evaluate the impact legislative recommended changes to procurement programs will have on Vermont jobs and the Vermont economy. The working group will be staffed by legislative council and on or before July 15th, 2023, JFO may issue an RFP to 1 or more independent third parties to provide facilitation and mediation services to the working group and economic data and analysis recommendations at the direction of the legislative members. The Department of Public Service will be invited to advise the working group about the results of its ongoing public process to review the standard. And the working group will bring us back draft legislation and a report to both our committee and Senate Natural Resources by December 1st, 2023. Committee members may submit minority opinions that shall be included with the report containing draft legislation. And so that's the proposal. Elena has put that into bill form for us. And the parties, the electric utilities, the environmental representatives for the environmental advocates and industry were all invited to share comments and thoughts on a high-level charge for developing this draft legislation. And they all submitted their comments, working with the chair. We kind of pulled all of that together towards what we think is may not be consensus, but close. So, and we will hear from I think that's it.
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And just to orient members, we're going to hear from the folks who helped develop this proposal, who wanted to testify today, and get their feedback on it briefly, because we are time constrained. But and Ellen can't join us because she's in Senate House of Ropes on S100. She'll be joining us as soon as she can. So, public service announcement, and Representative Lilly.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been working with folks from the affordable housing community, in particular VHFA and Evernorth, on adding a couple bullet points related to equity into the study. I've got that language here. I forwarded it on to Ellen and the chair and vice chair, and ran it by environmental advocates as well. And I'd be happy to share that with you. I don't have it in paper, just electronic version if you'd like to hear the ideas there.
I think it would be
Better when Ellen's here.
after, yeah, and let's hear from the folks who are in the room, and then we'll do a walkthrough with Ellen, and then we can.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, Ms. Porter, please join us.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Louis Porter, General Manager, Washington Electric Co-op. And I'll try to be brief, knowing you have many witnesses and also other work to do. First of all, I just want to say that how much I appreciate the work that's happened in the last several days. It's a much better proposal than we were working on earlier. And so a number of those changes are very, very positive. Notably, the inclusion of the department as is included in this draft is a great change, I think, a great improvement. Also, the way this is drafted in order to prevent there being two competing studies, I think makes a lot of sense. So this was written in such a way that there won't be two competing studies of the same topic. There'll be different organizations, different entities feeding their perspectives and their data in. So that's a great improvement. So overall, this is very, very much improved. I'll very briefly talk about Washington Electric and the renewable energy standard, just for context, but I will be brief. Washington Electric's 100% renewable. We're going to remain 100% renewable. So the going to 100% renewable energy standard, as those tiers are currently set up, doesn't have a huge direct effect on us, although there may be other effects, but we are and plan on remaining 100% renewable. The current renewable energy standard is I think working quite well in many aspects. Most importantly, the carbon load from the electric sector in Vermont has declined by about 80% since the RES came into being. That's not all due to the RES, but I think substantial portions of it are, and that's very positive. The electric sector now contributes only 2% or so of Vermonters' carbon load. So that's a huge improvement. That means that our mission from a climate perspective, from my point of view now, is to accelerate electrification of heating and transportation sectors, and simultaneously make sure that we're remaining a low emissions portfolio on the electric side. Energy Action Network reports that Vermont has the least carbon emissions of any electric portfolio in the country. We need to maintain that, and we need to make sure that people are moving from fossil fuels to use of those of that electric portfolio where appropriate, and make where it makes sense. So that's how I view our mission from a climate standpoint as it relates to the RES. Having said that, I think the RES is working fairly well as it is now, it always makes sense to gather data and look at what you're doing and make sure you're headed where you want to go and you're headed there as quickly as you want to go. So that makes sense, and I think that's the main work of this working group would be to evaluate that. So that makes sense. I have to say, net metering, as you've heard from me before, net metering is a major problem for some utilities in Vermont and their customer members. Washington Electric probably top of that list. Vermont Electric Co-op as well. I know Hardwick Electric also has an issue with net metering, and the basic issue there is that it's a very high cost of power, and it is a regressive cost shift from lower income members, customers, to subsidize to support those by generally higher income and better off Vermonters. So I appreciate the discussion of equity in this language, and I haven't seen the language yet, but I would say I would encourage you to consider economic opportunity and economic well-being as one form of equity among others that needs to be considered. And I'm sure you and the housing advocates are doing that. So thank you. I have one recommendation for a change. I think this proposal as it's now drafted implicitly includes net metering, but I would ask that you consider including net metering explicitly in it. One way to do that would be on page 2 of your draft bill, lines 19 and 20, to include the phrase including net metering after procurement programs. I think it's implied that this working group will examine current and future net metering policies. I think it's implied by the language as drafted, but I think it would be helpful to have it be explicitly part of their charge, and that would be one relatively not disruptive way to do that. So that's my testimony. Greatly improved. Appreciate the opportunity of being involved in it. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Do members have questions? Representative Sibilia.
Just a comment. I think that's a good suggestion to include in there.
Thank you. Terrific. Well, I'll be here if you have anything else. Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like we have Darren Springer joining us via Zoom.
Hi, good afternoon. Darren Springer, Burlington Electric. Sorry I can't be there in person. We're in the midst of our budget and rate cycle, which is somewhat intensive this time of year. I do have some slides. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I wanted to just bring up a couple just to add some context for the discussion and in a way kind of build on some of the points that Lewis Porter just made. Burlington Electric is also 100% renewable utility, and we plan to continue to be. This is a snapshot of our portfolio of resources in 2022. You can see we're very much roughly a third wood, a little more than a third hydro, a little less than a third wind, and then a small slice, a growing slice from solar. After we do sales and purchases of RECs, we continue to be 100% renewable, but we sell and buy RECs to benefit our ratepayers. And this is what our 2021 renewability looked like, largely hydro with some small amount from solar. I'll shift to the point in terms of Burlington. We have the most solar per capita of any city east of the Mississippi, according to Environment America. And kind of to the point that Lewis was making, the renewable energy standard is working really well for us and supporting us in our mission to become a net zero city, move towards more transportation electrification, more thermal electrification. It has worked on a state level to reduce the emissions from the electric sector. This graph shows the 2015 passage of the RES and the decline in emissions in Vermont. Similarly, there's new data. This is just published, I think, this week from the Agency of Natural Resources with updated through 2020 emissions data. And this shows the electric sector decline, as you can see, from 2015 down to 2020, with electricity being a little over 2% of the state's emissions from a greenhouse gas standpoint. So this is an important conversation, but the emissions reduction potential in the thermal and transportation sectors remains far larger. and is the main focus for us as a utility and as a city. In terms of where Vermont sits, our renewable energy standard is still fairly ambitious compared to a lot of other states. Some states have begun moving towards 100%. Not very many have 100% on the timeline of 2032, which is the time frame that our renewable policy runs through. I think you can see Washington, D.C. has something along those lines, and some other states are looking at 100% by 2040 or 2050. But we support being at 100% ourselves and support the state moving towards 100% in a cost-effective way. This just reinforces what Louis just said. Vermont has one of the largest shares of solar electricity in the country and has the cleanest power grid in the country. This was just a recent Washington Post analysis showing Vermont was the leading state in terms of the lowest carbon intensity for our grid in the country, which makes a great place to move to electric vehicles and heat pumps because we're getting the most benefit from an emission standpoint. I'll skip over this, but this is analysis from the Department of Public Service, just showing that the RES is going to continue, even under its current form, to continue to be more ambitious, continue to drive additional carbon reduction. And obviously the conversation here is whether there's an opportunity to even advance that further. Tier 3, I know Vice Chair Sibilia mentioned Tier 3. Tier 3 to us is the most important component of the bill. It's not the conversation for the work group, but it's the regulatory foundation that allows us to drive the electrification of the heating and transportation sectors. And it's really the core of the policy, kind of in our view. And then just to close, some key considerations as we look at this potential work group. Electric rates matter for the climate, given the conversation we just had. Our challenge in Burlington is we have been selling less megawatt hours, not more, but less over the last 10 plus years. And during the pandemic, that really declined even further. And unfortunately, there's been some upward rate pressure for us as a result of sales declines, inflation, and other costs challenges. And we want to make sure that any new policy development doesn't add rate pressure for our customers, particularly if we want to compete with EVs and heat pumps. It's important that our rates remain as low as possible in order to make that an attractive proposition for customers. I also wanted to point out Vermont's relatively unique in the nation in having not just one, but 3 utilities that are 100% renewable already. And obviously, we would hope that in any conversations around changing the RES, that there's consideration given to early adopter utilities like us in making sure that we don't have to change our portfolio in a costly way when we're already at 100% renewable. We're certainly interested in continuing to procure renewables for future load growth, but that's a different challenge and a different conversation. And then just in terms of the last slide I have here for the work group, and I agree with Louis that we appreciate the proposal and all of the work that's gone into it. We appreciate that DPS analysis is going to be provided. It may be that additional analysis, competing analysis at least, wouldn't be necessary from JFO, but I appreciate that they would be able to provide facilitation and data as needed. One concrete change I would propose, it's moderate change, but perhaps adding an entity that can represent commercial customers in the mix would be helpful. We have affordable housing represented in the work group with VHFA, which is excellent. And we think that, for us, 75% of our sales are commercial, and our 2 biggest customers are the University of Vermont and Medical Center. It'd be important to have a commercial customer representative or entity to join the group to represent that perspective. So that's one change we would propose. And I think in terms of what the work group's going to focus on, much of it was covered really well in Vice Chair Sibilia's opening remarks. We really are focused on ratepayer impacts, on the cost-effective way to get to 100% renewable, making sure we're not impacting strategic electrification in a negative way, and making sure that we keep the focus on Vermont's emissions. We don't have very much coming from the electric sector, but if we're going to get a benefit here, we want to make sure it's helping Vermont's emissions go even lower. And the last point I'll make is just that changes to this policy don't necessarily have to be dramatic. They can be incremental and revisited more often because utilities need stability in making long-term policy contract decisions. and to the greatest extent possible, aligning potential changes with the existing strategies that utilities have to get to 100% renewable in their integrated resource plans offers an opportunity to make sure that we're respecting those decisions that were made for power supply. I'll stop sharing my screen. I hope I was as brief as I was supposed to be. Glad to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Members have questions? Not seeing any. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Next, we have Andrea Cohen. Also,
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
you can.
Excellent. Thank you for hearing me from Johnson, Vermont, where I needed to be today. Appreciate the time and we'll be brief. I do not have slides today. I just wanted to share VEC's perspective that we welcome conversation regarding opportunities. Can we move faster, to meet our carbon reduction goals? So this work group, we have no objection to it all. We think the conversation could be very helpful. Frankly, we do this conversation every day with ourselves and our colleagues. Like, we are in the business of seeing how fast we can move. VEC has already in 2023 committed to 100% carbon-free power supply and 100% renewable power supply by 2030. But it's not only about can we do it faster, it's the questions you've been discussing already. Can we do it cost effectively? And especially, can we do it equitably? I will share, we look at our service territory, which is has a relatively high energy burden compared to other parts of the state. But even within our service territory, there's different situations. And we looked at, for example, net metering uptake in our service territory. And I can tell you that our assessment is that the folks who have the highest energy burden, the parts of our districts that have the highest energy burden have the least net metering. And in other parts of our service territory that have the least energy burden, meaning higher incomes relative to amount they spend on energy, that's where the most uptake of net metering is. So when it comes to, can we move faster? Can we do it cost effectively and equitably? That is a policy concern of ours, the current situation. So we welcome conversation about that. So I do ditto on Lewis's comment, making sure, I think it's in there, but being really explicit about that, and about the goal about energy equity being one of the highest priorities. And of course, reliability. And I think that is in the criteria of what we'd be looking at. I mentioned we have experts who work on these topics every day. We are all about having accurate, transparent, good information out there for you policymakers to make good decisions. There's a lot of times where we feel like our policy agenda is not, it's kind of like being framed as we're anti-renewable because we're not moving faster or willing to spend more. And we really take objection to that. We are moving as fast as we feel is responsibly given to our customer base, and our need to keep the lights on, even on a cold winter night when the sun is not shining. So how much are we willing to spend for what resources is something that maybe we can share some information about what our experts are dealing with every day and influence our pacing. But we are okay with the current res, but if we were going to make some changes, we really would want to see that done thoughtfully. So in sum, we think you've done a great job with where you're at with the study. We really appreciate the opportunity to weigh in and be part of the process because we really feel like we have some good information to share. So that's kind of the short version of our comments. And of course, we'll have more as we get into all this.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Members have questions? I'm not seeing any. Thanks again.
All right, thanks.
Is Connor Daly here? Yeah.
I am. Yes, I'm on the
Great.
screen.
There you are.
Can you hear me?
We may need you to turn your video off. Let's give another test.
How about now?
That's much better.
That's much better. Okay, great. Yes, no, thank you so much, Connor Daly for Vermont Public Power Supply Authority. Thank you for allowing me to do this remotely. Also, we have our monthly board meeting today. I will keep this pretty high level as the other utilities have spoken to our consensus with this also, and considering the fact that I am the new kid on the block with this group, having been with VEPSA for a week. So just some context for you. VEPSA itself, Joint Action Agency for 11 of Vermont's small municipal utilities, and we also do power supply for Washington Electric, as well as a couple of folks in New Hampshire and Maine, and manage the Renewable Energy Standard Program on behalf of our members. Really, we wanted to say, thank you so much to Chair Sheldon and Vice Chair Sibilia for welcoming us to the conversation, and we recognize and appreciate the charge that the legislature has been provided by leadership around reviewing and updating RES. And we are really eager, as others are, to be a constructive partner in the dialogue. From everything that we've seen, we agree with the framework that has been finalized so far in discussions with the utilities and environmental community, including especially the inclusion of VHFA. For the sake of this conversation, I just wanted to preview some of the things that we will be focused on and on emphasizing in this process and in other RES conversations. For VEPSA, we are, as Andrea noted, two major concerns around affordability and reliability, with new incremental increases in RES, specifically around affordability for the rural community, Vermont communities that our utilities serve. Living costs driven by structural inflationary factors continue to increase, and in about half an hour we'll most likely get a federal funds interest rate increase, which will have a huge impact on capital projects. And so we're sensitive to the affordability across all customer classes and income brackets, but to that point around energy equity, we're very sensitive to having those impacts disproportionately affect low and moderate income Vermonters in service areas. Second, on reliability, it's already challenging to find enough power for tier 1, and even more so depending what happens in potential shifts. And as we discuss renewable versus clean energy in this process, that can of course be leveraged with a diversified energy portfolio, potential storage, and just highlighting the importance of base power sources. So from VEPSA's point of view, we really appreciate our inclusion, and we just think that it's pretty critical that if we do not approach this work strategically, both procurement will be challenging and rural communities will face even higher costs. So thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and welcome to your new job. Do members have questions? Representative Sibilia.
Yes, thank you, Connor. I believe it was the suggestion of VIPSA to allow Stowe and Hyde Park to participate, and we've included them here if they would like to. I don't know if you have anything to say about that or not. But likely you will.
No, that's right. And they have expressed interest in being included in the process, but haven't heard anything just yet in the last couple of days.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you again for your testimony. Now we will welcome Dylan Zwicky.
Good afternoon. For the record, Dylan Zwicky with Leon Public Affairs here today on behalf of Green Mountain Power. I think we would echo many of what our colleagues in utility space have already spoken to this afternoon, so I'll try to keep these remarks very brief. Appreciate the conversations that have taken place over the last couple of days to shape up the language that is before you today. Overall, GMP is supportive of a balanced working group approach to evaluate the state's current renewable energy standard, with the goal of aligning it with the state's greenhouse gas reduction targets in the Global Warming Solutions Act, all while balancing the need to provide 24/7 reliable power to our customers. Just a quick moment to talk about what GMP is doing independent of any updates to the renewable energy standard. as part of the GMP's climate plan and integrated resource plan, we have a goal of achieving 100% renewable energy by 2030. So in advance of the 2032 75% tier 1 goal in the state's renewable energy standard. We think, as witnesses have alluded to, that as the state electrifies its transportation and thermal sectors, it is increasingly important that the power being provided comes from renewable sources. We are excited about some of the opportunities that are coming down the pipe through the Inflation Reduction Act. GMP recently launched and filed with the PUC a shared solar program that's focused on helping low and moderate income Vermonters go solar. And appreciate Representative Logan's development of some language. Would welcome the opportunity to take a look at that. When utilities broadly had provided some suggestions to the Senate Natural Resources Committee, in our list of suggestions, we did include some equity language. So happy to take a look and provide feedback. GMP is focused today on getting more renewables, both in-state and regionally, online at the lowest cost for customers. As Lewis and others alluded to, it's incredibly important that as the state electrifies and as we move our thermal and transportation sectors to electricity, that electricity is affordable. We can't afford to leave anyone behind. So overall, we're supportive of the approach and would be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thanks for your testimony.
Thank you.
Not seeing any questions. Welcome, Peter Sterling.
I do have some slides. I don't know if they can be put up on the screen. Hi, my name's Peter Sterling. I'm the Executive Director of Renewable Energy Vermont. This is my first time in this committee, so I just wanted to give a real brief introduction. My background is in environmental issues. I went to grad school at UVM for forestry and forest policy. And my first job after grad school was work on the Vermont Wilderness Act, which we passed. So I want to say thank you for all that 30 by 30 work, which keeps that moving. Actually, my first job when I was in grad school was working for VPIRG to expand the bottle bill in the late 90s. And the person at A&R was none other than Andrea Cohen.
We have a session for you.
Yeah. So thank you for wrapping up with a bow. Two of the things that I worked on that meant so much to me for so long. I've also been on the Sierra Club Executive Committee, and I'm currently the Vice Chair of VNRC. So I really do come at this from a real environmental background. Are we able to put the slides up? Oh, that's cool. So I guess I'll just jump right in. And
We have them on ours.
Oh, you do? Oh, okay. Didn't know that. All right. So the first
I
slide.
have a question from Representative Smith.
Oh, hi.
Ask a question, and I think you're the perfect person to answer this.
Oh, boy.
You mentioned something about always searching for the least expensive power source. What about nuclear?
I did.
I thought I heard something to
He hasn't
that effect.
He hasn't started his testimony yet.
Okay, well, what do you think about nuclear power? We don't hear much about nuclear power being talked about.
Well, I think, given the New England regional energy mix, nuclear power doesn't use fossil fuels. I mean, I think there's other problems with nuclear power, like where the waste goes and things like that. But in the short term, I think nuclear is a part of our mix. And unless we were able to replace it by renewables, which is pretty unlikely, it's probably worth keeping it in the mix.
Good answer for now, thank you.
But I will say the other part will go in my testimony. Our load's going to grow, and there's no new nuclear coming online anywhere in New England. So it's not going to meet our future. Okay, so you look at my first slide, why we need res reform. I just want to give a quick pitch. If there's one thing y'all could remember from what I talk about, every kilowatt hour of electricity generated by new solar in Vermont and in New England reduces electricity generation from fossil fuel plants somewhere in New England. You forget everything else I say, which is fine. The reason to do res reform is that when we bring renewables online in Vermont and New England, at some point somewhere else, it displaces natural gas and other fossil fuels. That is a super important reason. It helps our region achieve, greenhouse gas reductions. So if you look at this first slide, is just a quick example This is a natural gas plant in Dayville, Connecticut. I've talked to the fellow who lives next to this. It's a 60-acre, 300-megawatt natural gas plant. If you look at that picture to your left, that's the equivalent of area of going from the State House up to National Life, over to Shaw's, if you know where that is in Montpelier, and back up to the library. So 60 acres is a big chunk of land. Oh, it is the highway. So Vermont has no such natural gas plant. And if you can imagine trying to site a 60-acre natural gas plant in Vermont, it probably would not fly. But when we don't use renewables in Vermont, it's plants like these that run. I think that's a really important reason to consider why we need to move forward on res reform. There's 81 of those around the region. Vermont does have 5 what we call peaker plants. Those are oil plants that run very rarely. Most of the peaker plants for the extra load that we need, those are also in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And I could send you all a map if you wanted, but most of the plants, our base fossil fuel plants and the peaker ones, are not located in areas that are predominantly white and predominantly wealthy. So when we do burn fossil fuels in this region for our power, it is coming, at someone else's expense. And we don't do that in Vermont to generate our own power. So that's one of the big reasons to do res reform. Next, why Vermont needs res reform. Our electricity isn't as sustainable as load grows. Most of our power is kind of capped. We're not gonna be able to get more nuclear power. Our hydro resources are limited. I certainly think that there's not a lot of appetite for more biomass burning. Certainly there's a lot of discussion in some areas about whether we want to take more Hydro-Quebec. So really, as our load grows, there's 2 places it's going to come from, either the New England system mix, which is largely fossil fuels, or it's going to come from renewables. And that's, I think, what's driving, our discussion today is our load's going to grow. We're asking everyone to electrify everything. Where's that new power going to come from? And then when we look at our requirement for new renewable energy, again, like what's going to help us get carbon out of the atmosphere, our requirement for new renewables is the worst in New England. We have a 10% renewable energy requirement, new renewable energy requirement. Other states have much higher ones. Please stop me if there's any questions. I'm going a mile a minute here. And then I think you've heard this before. I just want to make sure, how did we get here? The 2015 Renewable Energy Standard set 2 energy targets for 2032. Tier 1, it's 75% of retail sales from renewable facilities that can deliver power to the New England grid. 10% of that, called Tier 2, comes from an in-state source under 5 megawatts. So that's our only new energy requirement, is the stuff we have to build in the state. And that is problematic. The next slide, the res.
I think we have a question on the previous slide.
Oh, sure.
Actually,
Okay. Previous.
So no, this one right here. That slide wasn't up while you were speaking.
I'm sorry.
Hello.
Okay.
Just reading.
They're online.
I've got too many things. Yeah. Same time. Sorry.
Cool.
Thank you.
You can keep it.
All right. So the next slide, the res was not designed to address climate change. And you can see this quote from the Department of Public Services annual report. They have a couple other similar quotes. The regional impact on renewable energy is limited. And what I'd like to just walk through briefly is why. So Vermont is the only state that allows for large out-of-region hydro to be counted as renewable in its RPS, in its renewable energy standard. So what happens in Vermont is we take much of the REC credits, renewable energy credits that are generated by our wind projects and our solar. We sell them out of state for, you can see on average about $35. Other states use that to meet their RPS requirements. Our utilities legally, I'm not saying any utility is doing anything wrong or underhanded. It's totally legal. This is the system that was given to them by the legislature. Backfill those renewable energy credits with very cheap RECs that are not legal for other states' RPSs. So instead of keeping those RECs home and retiring them to meet our RPS requirements, we sell them out of state, which diminishes the need for new renewables in other states. Is that clear as mud to folks, or should I say that again? So because we're the only state that allows for out of region large old hydro to be counted as renewable, it depresses the amount of new renewable energy, the amount of new renewables brought online around the region. And that's very problematic and should be fixed.
Oh, since you brought it up, showing why it's perceived by some to be renewable and by others not to be would be helpful. Hydro.
I don't know why other states did that. I mean,
That's another way of saying it. Why is Vermont outstanding in its field?
well, I can't say why that decision. I mean, I know the effect of why when that decision was made in 2015, it was because it was a way to finance, a lot of the work we were doing to allow those renewable energy credits to be, to retired here. It would save the utilities a lot of money. And they used that money, quite honestly, to move forward on tier 3, which was great. They used it to bring down the price, keep rates down as we brought on more in-state renewables. So I think that was probably the reason. I bet you Ben could talk to it. He was around when the first res was written. Maybe he can answer that in more detail. But we do allow, old out-of-state hydro to be part of our RPS. We're the only ones in New England that do it, and it does have an impact on, greenhouse gas emissions around the region.
Representative Logan.
Thank you. What are some, I could make a comment here, but what are some other reasons that you're aware of that we may not want to consider hydro part of our renewable mix?
Okay, okay. Just to be clear, I didn't say that. What I said was, just to be clear, are Vermont being unique in allowing RECs from hydro to be retired, unbundled from the energy we purchase, is having a dampening effect on renewables and other in deployment in Vermont and in the region. I think actually, honestly, Hydro-Quebec plays a pretty important role in keeping us moving toward a renewable energy future, because without Hydro-Quebec, there's no other place for us to get renewable energy on the scale and the reliability they can provide until there's another source, which there may be, and may never be. Maybe offshore wind happens. I don't know. I mean, Hydro-Quebec is lowering our greenhouse gas emissions as a state. I mean, there's nothing else that could replace it and do what it does at the price that it does. It's the backfilling of our RPS, our tier 1 requirement with the REC credits that's hurting. It's not actual existence of Hydro-Quebec power that we purchase. Is there another question? Representative, all right, so you have a question?
Not about this specific.
Okay.
So I'll say that.
So we can go to the next slide. And just as an example, again, about how our res is different than every other state's. So again, the Department of Public Service in their annual report, they look at how Vermont does with retiring their credits and how renewable we look. And you can see the donut on the left there. We would look 72% renewable right now when you look at all the things that are legal in our RPS. But if you were any other state in New England, maximum of 20% of our power would be considered renewable in any other RPS. So we are truly an outlier in what we consider renewable and the way we backfill. And it is probably time to consider changing, how we go about doing this. Okay. So the next one, a lot of times we hear about affordability and the cost of power. Next year's estimates for renewable energy generation this decade, near firm wind and near firm solar, that basically means paired with storage, come in super low. You can see existing natural gas is slightly higher. Offshore wind is much higher. And this, again, these are national numbers. So I think the New England numbers might be different, but it gives you an idea that wind and solar are projected to come down a lot more by the end of this decade. And that's a good reason for Vermont to consider moving forward with res reform today to prepare for that. Another thing I hear a lot about is, some of the land use issues if we're to move forward with more renewables in Vermont. I particularly hear about what would happen to our ag land. Vermont currently has about 1 million acres of prime ag soils. The Farmland Information Center found that we've lost about 21,000 acres of ag land to residential uses up to 2016. Another 41,000 acres are projected to be converted by 2040. In 2022, the PUC, Public Utility Commission, issued CPGs for 19 large solar projects. Collectively, less than 100 acres of prime ag soils fell within the disturbance area for these projects. So when we consider moving forward with more in-state renewables, I think it's pretty fair to say the evidence doesn't really support that it will be a threat to our farmers or our farmland. And I have just two more slides. The next one, Rev did some modeling to see how much land we would actually need to use if we were to double our in-state renewables and base it on solar. Our model found that current tier 2 requirements would take about 700 acres of solar to get to the 10% requirement. If we were to double it to 20%, that would take about an additional 2,300 acres of solar around the state. That doesn't seem like an unreasonable number to me. If it's spread around the state in a fair way. As comparison, that a pretty well-known 2017 study from Harvard found that residential sprawl consumes about 1,500 forested acres a year in Vermont. And then my last data point on this, we hear a lot about the carbon sequestration benefits of forest. And by all means, I am not suggesting we just start mowing down forests to put up solar panels. That's not at all what I'm saying. But when you think about on balance, converting an acre of typical New England, northern hardwood forest to solar takes about 15 times more carbon out of the atmosphere, in large part because our power is based on so much natural gas. So until we clean up our power supply, putting up a solar panel actually takes more carbon out of the atmosphere than the amount that most New England forests can sequester in a given year.
Who is Synapse Energy Economics?
They're a consulting firm out of Massachusetts. I have other sources for other similar studies that's not an outlier in the studies. But again, I don't want to say we should just start cutting down our forest to put up solar panels. But if we're talking about someone who's got, a lot and they want to cut down a couple acres to put up a 250 kilowatt array, that on balance would do more to take carbon out of the atmosphere. I don't have to go into this slide too much. This was from our bill that we introduced with Representative Caleb Elder. There's most of the environmental groups and other groups supported moving forward. And here's some things that so I just wanted to give you an idea that there were many groups supporting res reform. You can read the details. It's in H320. And then my last slide is we had two changes. I guess everyone's called their changes moderate so far, so I'll jump on the bandwagon here. Whether any changes to Vermont's existing renewable energy requirements or other energy policies are needed to increase grid stability, resiliency, modernization, and reliability. So we just thought or other energy policies would be important to add right there.
Representative Sibilia.
Just making sure that we're oriented to the correct place. That's number one under the report, right? That's
I don't actually have the statute. Sorry.
Yes.
I can email this.
It is.
Thank you. Sorry about that. And then
right here.
And then under the JFO analysis, we thought it would just be cleaner to just not limit it to economic data. Just call it data and analysis. Gave the committee more room to move on getting the information it needed. And then my last slide,
so just trying, because we have so little time with us, just making sure the committee's here.
Okay.
So that second piece is on page 3. And we are line 6 and 7. Okay.
And then the last slide, because I just can't help myself, have to end with, this is the real reason to do this again. More new renewables means less fossil fuels burned in New England. And I would like to really thank Representative Sibilia for all the work she did to pull all this together. While it's not what I would have written, it does represent a really admirable compromise that should set the legislature up to make significant progress on this in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Representative Pat.
Thank you. I think people know that I started raising some of the issues that some of the utility representatives have mentioned here about 25 years ago. Have you given any thought as to whether there is any way to have a renewable energy standard, no matter what the individual requirements and tiers are, but whether that can be applied in some way at a statewide level rather than utility by utility? Because as we've heard, when it's applied utility by utility, you get a very disparate impact on the utilities and their ratepayers and causes equity issues and all of that. So if we were trying to, and maybe this group can look into that, if we're trying to achieve the total amount of new renewable energy, can that be looked at as a statewide issue rather than utility by utility?
Yeah, I think that's definitely what we're saying. I think you mentioned what I thought sounded like a great idea to me a couple months ago. Let's socialize the cost of net metering across all utilities. I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
That's one example.
I mean, one of the ideas that I've always thought of, if you really want to socialize the cost, I mean, let's take it off the utility bill. And the utility bill is the most regressive bill there is. And if this is a state policy to have more affordable renewables, let's figure out a way to do it through some other form of revenue and not off the utility bill. So I think there's a lot of ideas we can push out there that would make sure this all is done fairly. And we certainly are open to anyone.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. This is a process question. I have one thing that I'd love to talk about with the committee. And since we have everybody in terms of language, and since we have everybody relevant in the room, I wonder at what point it makes sense to raise it and see if anyone, has deep concerns with it.
Sure, we have just a couple more witnesses, so I would like to hear from them and then we'll have that opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time and thank you all so much for getting into this so late in the session. Really is appreciated.
Thanks for the testimony. Next is Ben Walsh.
Thank you for having me. For the record, Ben Edgerly Walsh. I'm the Climate and Energy Program Director with BPIRG. I will be brief. I did want to, though, start by thanking you for all the hard work you've done on S5, on a lot of bills. I know you've done a lot of heavy lifting this year and really deeply appreciate you getting to this important topic before the end of the legislative session. Getting more renewable energy built is critical for a host of reasons. Top of our list is from an emission standpoint in the electric sector, the ways that you can reduce emissions are getting more renewables built or using less electricity. And we've done a really fantastic job of the latter and a good job of getting new renewables built, but there's a lot more that from our perspective at VPIRG, we need to do there. I want to just very briefly share a high level, a couple of high level considerations we have as we're thinking about this, and then obviously speak to the working groups specifically. When we're thinking about our goals in the electric sector, we're talking about reliability, we're talking about affordability, we're talking about renewability and carbon. And those are sort of the three legs of the stool that's obviously embodied in this language in the working group. And I think that's very important. As we electrify our heating and transportation sectors, from our perspective, we think it makes sense to get out in front of this. You heard testimony today about how right now load in some utilities in Vermont is flat or even declining a little bit. That's not going to be true for long. Right now we're selling 3,000 electric vehicles a year in Vermont. There's about 9,000 on the road, maybe 40,000 heat pumps in buildings around the state. We need an order of magnitude more than that by 2030 and far more than that by 2050. So if we're talking about needing more renewable energy to meet increasing load, getting started very soon makes sense to us. From our perspective, and Mr. Sterling spoke to this to a significant degree, so I'll be brief, but it really is critical that we're getting new renewables built. We absolutely agree that there needs to be a balance between existing renewables and new renewables, but right now we feel like the balance is too strongly in favor of existing renewable energy and the RECs from existing renewable energy. So we're very interested in having a conversation about how do we move in the direction of getting more new renewables built more quickly and doing that in a way that actually works from a reliability standpoint and reduces the cost of the renewables we're procuring relative to what tier 2 costs today. And again, from the standpoint of this working group and the language before you, I definitely think it speaks to that, the need for that. And I think the conversations this working group would have around how to do that well and thoughtfully would be very productive. I also just want to mention briefly, and you heard me say something similar on S5, but I did want to mention the Inflation Reduction Act. for the next 10 years, the federal government is going to pick up the tab of 30 to 40, in some cases more, 30 to 40% of the cost to construct new renewable energy. That very likely will go away in the early 2030s. And so if we're looking at a world where we think it's maybe a good idea to build new renewable energy, again, getting that done sooner rather than later, while the federal government is picking up the tab for that construction, makes a lot of sense from our perspective. So again, really appreciate this ball getting rolling this year, recognizing that implementation of something that could maybe happen next year would still be in the second half of this decade. The last thing I want to talk about, of course, is the actual working group. Really appreciate the work that's been put into it, the trajectory that it's on. Definitely agree that having some capacity from JFO makes a lot of sense. And I agree with Mr. Sterling's suggestions on that front, that they should be allowed to, if the legislative members of this working group think it's helpful, bring data and analysis that is outside of strictly the economic silo. There's a lot of data and analysis to be done on something like renewable energy deployment, and siloing them only to the economic analysis, as critical as that is, doesn't make sense from our perspective. And then the other piece on broadening the language around resilience and reliability, there's a lot of pieces of that puzzle: energy storage and demand response. It's not just about aren't we building renewables and where they are. So agree with broadening that language so that you can have legislation that and report back next year that really digs into how do we do this in a way that advances resilience in the face of a climate that is going to make grid resilience harder, not easier over time. And I'll just say, I know you heard a couple of other suggestions. The one that Mr. Porter brought forward on net metering makes sense. I think that would have to be part of the mix when you're talking about procurement programs, but we certainly wouldn't have any problem with that language. Happy to serve on this if that is your pleasure, and really appreciate you doing work on this important topic at this late stage in the session.
Great. Thanks for your testimony.
Thank you.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Martin. Then the previous witness mentioned that all other states, don't use Canadian hydro, et cetera, for renewable energy credits. And that there isn't sort of the selling of the higher priced credits and then purchasing the lower priced credits to sort of to bring the renewability back up. And the term there usually is arbitrage. I really thought other states did do arbitrage.
So that is the term that I would use. And I think any state that has a renewable portfolio standard, utilities are going to buy and sell renewable energy credits. That's the way it works. And they're going to do that, in a way that benefits their customers, and to an extent, if depending on the utility, if they have shareholders, maybe they're shareholders. The difference here in Vermont is we have a requirement of 70%, and 65% of that requirement is allowed to come from large, old, out-of-state resources. And so it's not necessarily a difference in terms of it's done here, it's not done other places. It's a difference sort of in scale and in allowing those particular resources or unbundled RECs from those resources to play in our renewable portfolio standard. It's worth noting that there are other states that it's not like we're the only New England state that gets any power from north of the border. Having it in the mix in the renewable energy standard is the difference there. And then just to reiterate, that is not something we are opposed to. We want to make sure that we're striking the right balance so that we can achieve those, the reliability, the affordability, and the carbon reduction requirements. And from our perspective, that last one requires construction of new renewables and buying a REC from HQ. I have seen no evidence to suggest that that is going to get more renewable energy built or generated. So having those sorts of safeguards in place to strike the right balance amongst those demands of this sort of policy.
So to repeat back, other states are buying and selling arbitrage. The issue is that we're doing more of that and less of new renewables as compared to other states. And then that other states don't necessarily use Hydro-Quebec as compliance for credits.
For their renewable portfolio standards, yes. And then, I mean, there's the other difference here in Vermont is we have the 10% new renewables. We don't have any requirement for larger renewables somewhere in ISO New England. So the sort of offshore wind right now, if it were built, doesn't really have a place in our renewable portfolio standard, which from our perspective doesn't make sense. We should be building more here. We should be building more other places. So, appreciate that that is something that the language does speak to.
Thank you. Representative Tory.
Thank you, Ben. I'm just looking at the working group members. I'm wondering what you think of including Belco.
They're included.
They are?
It just doesn't look like Belcher.
Included.
Power.
Oh.
Company. Yeah.
Much better. Thank you.
You would think the acronym and would match up. And since you asked the question, I think it's a good idea. They have a very important perspective.
Yeah.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you for taking time.
Next, we will welcome TJ Poor.
There. Thank you. TJ Poor, Vermont Department of Public Service. A lot of witnesses have talked about the need for res reform, the Clean Climate Action Plan and the Comprehensive Energy Plan have both called for analysis of our renewable energy standard to see if we can do better, whether it's a 100% renewable energy standard or 100% carbon-free standard. And so, taking that broad picture, I think 100% carbon-free standard doesn't remove a renewable energy component to it. It would be additive, but these are called for. I don't think there's any disagreement that we should be looking at our renewable energy standard and looking at how to do better. And so the department, I've been here talking about, did I introduce myself?
Yeah, you did.
Sure. Okay, thank you. I mentioned the department, sorry. Trying to get through it quickly and now I've slowed down. I've talked a little bit about here the department's public engagement process broadly, but we are also doing technical analysis that is in parallel and connected with that. And what this technical analysis is intended to do, and here is like just a really high level scope of this. I pulled this from slides that I did for Senate Natural a couple of weeks ago, I think on the 18th, and it's just one slide out of there. It's a high level scope of work that we have connected with some stakeholders on this, but to actually do some technical analysis to evaluate scenarios like 100% carbon free versus 100% renewable with different levels of in-state generation and different variables. Do we allow renewable energy credits from Hydro-Quebec? Something we can look at. What are the transmission and distribution impacts of different levels of penetration of distributed generation and different sizes of it? How does, what happens if you apply storage to that? Does that help, or the mix? And just a number of different scenarios and sensitivities to that. And I just provide here kind of the list of what we're looking at. One of them is, as Mr. Edgerly Walsh and Mr. Sterling mentioned, kind of requirement to purchase renewable energy from new facilities delivering generation in New England. I just point that out because it's something we definitely want to consider and should consider, and it's good that it's in here. I'll get to the working group in a second. That there's a little bit of talking past each other when folks say that Vermont is the only state that allows large hydro to count for its renewable portfolio standard. So that is technically true, right? For each state's renewable portfolio standard, Vermont's the only one that includes it for the renewable portfolio standard. But other states have other requirements, like a Clean Energy Standard in Massachusetts as an example, which works with its renewable portfolio standard to look at the overall portfolio of Massachusetts utilities and their requirements. And that Clean Energy Standard does allow, calls for existing hydro from Hydro-Quebec counts for that standard. Connecticut also has procurement where they allow both nuclear and hydro from Quebec. So those are not called renewable portfolio standards in those other states. So technically, what folks were saying is accurate. We're the only state in our renewable portfolio standard that allows large hydro. But our renewable energy standard is effectively, a renewable portfolio standard and a clean energy standard combined right now. So I just wanted to clear up that what I think is kind of it's a technicality in how we talk, and I just want to make sure the committee is kind of aware of how that all works together. That isn't to say we shouldn't look at how much from each source and what sources are right for Vermont. And so the technical analysis is intended to draw on some scenarios and create some scenarios that will look at that. And I think there's a lot of agreement on we should look at how much should we rely on imports, how much should we just develop in-state versus how much should we look at in the New England region. And our analysis is intended to do that. And we're also doing this through a stakeholder process that is intended to mimic the process that the Climate Council is using, where we share a scope of work with a stakeholder group. And we shared that this week, a draft scope of work from our technical analysis with most of the entities on this list that are in the working group here. A couple of additions are, we also shared it with Global Foundries, who has a renewable energy standard requirement, and the Agency of Natural Resources as it relates to land use. We're going to share it with the RPCs, regional planning commissions, if we haven't, and we can share it with anybody who's interested. But so with that process, we're looking for all kinds of input on all of the input assumptions that go into the scope of work. We're looking, so when we get a contractor, we'll say, here are the key assumptions, here are the case scenarios. And we have a couple of placeholders for help us develop other scenarios that you want to see analyzed. And draft results, stakeholder engagement, final results, stakeholder engagement, and really trying to build that collective knowledge and kind of level up so we're all speaking from the same data. Eventually, what legislation comes from it or recommendations come from it that may differ on the data. There's probably, any 1 point estimate is going to be wrong. There'll probably be a range of estimates of the impact and how different entities place emphasis on different priorities will reflect kind of those recommendations that come out of here. To the working group, I very much appreciate the department being invited to advise the working group. I don't think we should be, I thought about it over the last day, I don't think we should be part of the drafting legislation with this group. So I think that's an appropriate kind of separation. But the language as it is now, I believe, is maybe a little narrow on what we can advise on. It's really just the results of the ongoing public process, but there may be other things that related to any one of these items here that could be useful. We have a lot of data from the utilities, and so it would be great if we were able to participate as much as we can, and then not necessarily on the actual drafting, because I think that that may not be appropriate. I don't have specific language suggestions at the moment to do that, but.
Makes sense. I think we hear.
Yeah, great, thanks. The other thing that, two things I'll mention is just a couple of the things that the working group are going to report on are they may be dependent in some instances, maybe not dependent is the right word, but they're very overlap quite a bit with the technical analysis that is going to happen. So I just am hopeful that if this working group goes forward, that we'll be able to work together to kind of share the results that we have and vice versa. If there's other information that the working group kind of wants to see or test sensitivities to the extent that it's possible within the contract, that we could work together. So there's really kind of a cohesive set of information. What I worry about is the working group coming up with, cost-effective procurement policies that, use vastly different assumptions and inputs than the technical analysis that we're working on. And then it becomes really hard to kind of understand the similarities or differences in the two bodies of work in order to kind of make recommendations going forward. Kind of like, the discussion on what's included in an RPS, right? You can take it from different perspectives, but if we're on the same page of what the end effect is or what the data means, then we'll all be better off going forward.
Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, I'd like to just interject here that I see these two processes as complementary, synergistic, not oppositional, or competitive. So we've got our utilities, we've got our industry, our environmental groups, and our regulators that all have to be on the same page at the end of the day. Hence the facilitation and mediation services that have been included here in bill.
Yeah, I think that's gonna be helpful. The last point I will make here is the recommended changes on the joint fiscal offices, what they can do. Again, economic data and analysis recommendations that can be really broad, and that is a lot of what is going to be contained in the study that the department's going to do. One thing that I talked a little bit about this morning in a discussion with Senate Natural Resources, our scope of work, does a lot of scenario analysis and technical analysis on rates and economic impacts, from a societal perspective, from a ratepayer perspective, from a consumer perspective. But all that comes out with outputs on kind of an annual basis of here's some increased costs, here's some decreased costs that nets out. What it can do, but it doesn't currently, is take those outputs and then input it into kind of it's called an econometric model, the type of modeling that gets you impacts on gross domestic product for the state, the job impacts, increased renewable energy will mean increased construction in the state. So that has like positive economic impacts. If the cost of renewable energy was higher than what it otherwise would be, that would be kind of a countervailing effect on the economy and jobs. And so that type of analysis is something that is not currently in, it's alluded to in our study. We could do it if we have the money, and that's an area where JFO has a lot of experience. I think they use, Jeff Carr, Tom Cravett, those folks to do that kind of modeling. And if there were economic analysis and data, and if that was to be done by JFO, that's where I would focus it. Overall, in general, to the extent this could be a synergistic process, I think those are my comments. I don't necessarily. I think more conversation is good. All these stakeholders, or most of them, would be presumably involved in our technical analysis. I'm worried about my own resources, but other than that, I think the more conversation and the more we can elevate everybody's base understanding, so we're not talking past each other, would be a plus.
Thank you for your testimony. Representative Stebbins.
Thank you. When it comes to in-state renewables, one of the things that I don't see commented here is the role of, I don't know if it's RPCs, but there is a part here that we could set in-state requirements that, frankly, for all intents and purposes, you can't build wind energy here in Vermont. So I'm wondering whether or not there is a place in this study to talk about or look into the challenges to site renewables when you have to look at them in this state. Because we've seen a lot of renewable projects not be built because people don't want to look at them. So I wonder if you have any thoughts. I don't want to be angry at you. I'm angry at the NIMBYism that is very rampant in Vermont. Any thoughts on that? I mean, and I know that this really should be focused on renewables, but what's the point on an in-state goal if, like, everyone who says they're pro-sustainable ends up saying, nope, not here, not here, not here.
So as it's currently constructed, I think that might be outside of the scope of this study in how to deal with siting. We did try, I'm thinking back to the last time the legislature addressed siting at Act 174, I think, of 2016, maybe.
Not here.
It gave towns deference, substantial deference is the key word in siting procedures if they've developed a town plan. That town plan can't say we don't want solar anywhere. It can say, like, here's a good spot for distributed generation, here's a bad spot, but it has to kind of still allow for enough space to kind of have a contribution towards our renewable energy targets. None of those plans have been tested, to my knowledge, in the Public Utility Commission process. So there's probably a little less than half the towns have gone through and created energy plans and had those certified either through their regional planning commission or through with the commission's plans then certified by the department. And it is I'm not sure if that's one avenue that maybe it hasn't. I don't know that there's been a wind project proposed, and maybe it's just the fear of the NIMBYism for the last 5 years since that act has been passed. But
I think it's the sound standards make it impossible to build.
Right.
Yeah.
So that I think is. So I think to me, that's outside of the scope of this study. I guess I'm not really prepared to talk about the sound standards, but that could be up for another conversation on what's the appropriate level of, I really don't know anything about sound standards, but I know the commission process, and they went through a process and came up with sound levels, testimony, and
to be clear, I'm not proposing that we, there's a lot of support to this. I'm not proposing that we jeopardize the support for this. It's just, it is an issue, it's a large elephant in the room that when it comes to in-state renewables. So I'll shelf that.
Thanks. We need to move on. But did you have one?
One last comment related to that is, I think Vermont is the only state that has a requirement that is drawn around its distribution system, right? So the tier 2 requirement, other states don't in their renewable requirements. They all say new in New England. And Vermont has new connected to the distribution system. And so that is a distinction in how the portfolio standards are drawn up. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And that could be another thing to consider as we look at different scenarios for, do we want to increase that? Do we want to have regional, et cetera? I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Went on beyond my time.
Thank you for your testimony. What I'd like to do is have our legislative council walk us through the language. And then need to being aware of the time. Welcome back, Ellen.
So, Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. So I think you have drafted as an amendment to H1 S112. So draft 1.1 dated 5/2/23, 7:02 p.m. Yes, so Renewable Energy Standard Working Group. The Legislative Working Group on Renewable Energy Standard Reform is created to draft legislation to be considered by the General Assembly during the 2024 legislative session. Membership, the Legislative Working Group on Renewable Energy Standard Reform will be convened by 2 members from the House appointed by the Speaker of the House, and 2 members of the Senate appointed by the Committee on Committees. Just wanted to point out here, it doesn't say that they're the chairs of the committee. So I don't know if it's not a huge issue, but this doesn't really like say who would be the chair of the committee. So, but it does say it will be convened by whoever is appointed, the 2 legislative members from each body. So that's 4 members, and then subsection 2 lists the rest of the members. So the working group shall also be made up of 1 representative from Green Mountain Power, Burlington Electric Department, Vermont Public Power Supply Authority, Washington Electric Co-op, Vermont Electric Co-op, Vermont Public Interest Research Group, Renewable Energy Vermont, Conservation Law Foundation, Vermont Electric Power Company, Vermont Housing and Finance Agency, Vermont Natural Resources Council, and the Sierra Club. Stowe Electric and Hyde Park Electric may name a representative to the working group if they choose. So I think that adds up to 18 members. So you may want to consider if it should be an odd number.
Maybe adding some members to help with that.
Okay. On page 2, duties. In addition to submitting draft legislation, the working group shall report on the following: whether any changes to Vermont's existing renewable energy requirements are needed to increase grid stability, resiliency, modernization, and reliability. Identifying any barriers to moving to a 100% renewable standard for all electric utilities by 2030. Recommending cost-effective procurement policies to increase new renewable energy and storage to offset increasing in-state load, improve grid stability and resiliency, and that factor in integrated resource planning, electric load growth projections. Whether increasing the requirement for out-of-state renewable procurements within or delivered into the ISIL New England territory can ensure affordable electric rates. Evaluating the impact legislative recommendations may have on Tier 3 implementation, and evaluating the impact legislative recommended changes to procurement programs will have on Vermont jobs and the Vermont economy. Assistance. The working group shall have legal assistance from the Office of Legislative, from the, oh, I'm missing the word office there, from the Legislative Council, so that would be the Office of Legislative Council. And administrative assistance from the Office of Legislative Operations. On or before July 15th, 2023, the Joint Fiscal Office may issue a request for proposal for 1 or more independent third parties to provide facilitation and mediation services to the working group and economic data and analysis recommendations at discretion of at the direction of the legislative members. I do just want to point out that I find that to be odd to have both our office does regularly staff summer study committees, but I haven't done one specifically where there's been an RFP for facilitation and mediation services as well as economic data and analysis. Also, the department shall be invited to advise the working group about the results of its ongoing public process to review the renewable energy standard. Compensation reimbursement or attendance at meetings during adjournment of the General Assembly. A legislative member of the working group serving in their capacity shall be entitled to per diem compensation and reimbursement under 2 VSA section 23 for not more than 6 meetings. Oh, so I added 6 meetings, I think. So that's roughly 1 a month. That was a question. I meant to highlight those. I apologize. So if you want to include a specific number of meetings, you can, you don't have to, but if you're budgeting for per diems, you may want to have a definitive number.
My sense would be we might want 8.
And then other members of the working group who are not otherwise compensated by their employer shall be entitled to per diem compensation under section 1010 for not more than 6 meetings or however many you decide. On to page 4, the payments under this subsection E, that should be E. Sorry, subsection E, shall be made from monies appropriated by the General Assembly. Report, the working group shall submit draft legislation and report on its deliberations and findings to the House Committee on Environment and Energy and the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Energy by December 1, 2023. Working group members may submit minority opinions that shall be included with the report containing the draft legislation. So I'm going to be working on this, huh?
Looks like it.
Okay. 18 members strikes me as a lot.
Yes. It's a lot. And Representative Logan, would you like to share what you've been working on?
Sure, and I forwarded that on to you as well. The language has 2 elements of study, one on energy equity, and it's not posted anywhere. I apologize. I'd be happy to.
Did you send it to the whole committee?
I didn't. I just sent it to you and the vice chair, so I can forward. Just one moment.
You send it. Great question.
This morning, I think it was.
Oh, it was 6.
Yeah, it's pretty early.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So energy equity. Assuming that equity is a policy goal in the reduction of our carbon footprint, then it needs to be matched with incentives and considerations targeted to low and moderate income Vermonters. And I would add, is there an issue?
Yeah, is it in a Word document or is it just in?
No, it's in an email.
Okay. So,
Yeah. I would add historically marginalized members of historically marginalized communities and low and moderate income Vermonters. So the study question is, how do current programs impact environmental justice households and LMI households? And how can a revised renewable energy standard assure that benefits and burdens are distributed equitably? So that's the question around equity
For the report.
for the report.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's a second study question, essentially inventorying residential building types and the renewable energy that reaches those types of buildings. So historically, the benefits of renewables have been concentrated in higher income, single family homes. Renters, and in particular, low income renter households have not had access to the benefits of renewables. So the question would be, how can we change the res to address this inequity?
Representative Scalia.
Madam Chair, I would support these two bullet points. Discuss too.
Yeah. Been brought up multiple times, so thanks for working on that, Kate. Representative Torrey.
Just thinking back on Representative Pat's comment earlier today about the impacts on rural customers. If rural be inserted in that second, as you're looking at buildings, where the buildings are, in the sense that it does cost more to do net metering in rural electric. Or is that outside of the scope of the RMA?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, that's exactly I think it's stating it broadly enough to surface all of the different equity implications of the renewable energy standard. I think, the idea being, if we say, for example, adopted a renewable energy standard where all of the renewable energy in Vermont needed to be produced within Vermont, that would not be the most cost-effective means of supplying renewable energy to Vermonters, and would have disparate impacts, especially because of having multiple utilities, some which serve rural communities. So there are then there are racial inequities in homeownership. There are, I don't know, like we could get very specific and have a list of about 35 different kinds of inequity, or we could leave it to the study. I don't know.
I think Representative Pat.
Just to clarify, in terms of what I said earlier, when I was talking about the disparities and inequities among utilities, I was not specifically singling out the rural factor, because in fact, and this goes back to my old history 20-something years ago, the two utilities that have the most in common in terms of the inequitable impacts of some of the renewable energy policy, Washington Electric Co-op and Burlington Electric, which are demographically the most polar opposites in the state of Vermont. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the main reason was that those are two utilities that had moved ahead on renewables without being asked and before anyone was making requirements. Basically being asked now in effect to dump some of what they had done and replace it with new stuff at higher cost.
Ellen.
So I am just seeing this language. I am wondering if the makeup of the study committee has expertise to address these questions, or how they will go about addressing these questions. Also, I think that is then 8 things that they need to address, which does feel like
A lot with a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have thoughts on that, Representative Logan? I think we heard from, we got an email from Maura Collins at VHIP. HFA, thank you. That they support this language and they would be interested in participating.
yes, they are on the list.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
One quick comment on that, and then
Great.
and then another comment. Without the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition having an executive a permanent executive director established and advocating for affordable housing communities in Vermont. It's difficult for me to know who I would recommend, but Vermont Housing Finance Authority agency has expertise in tenant, in renters. So does Housing Vermont, which is Evernorth. Evernorth builds affordable rental housing, period, specifically rental housing. So VHFA works on housing affordability across homeownership and rental property, whereas Evernorth works rental property alone. Anyhow, it's a lot of people. VHFA is awesome. And the other thought that I had is that one thing that isn't specifically mentioned in this language is how to pay for equity. We had very extensive conversations about that with respect to the Affordable Heat Act. It's a very different policy in terms of carbon emissions reductions, because it's, we're setting a very high bar for renewable energy, potentially with this policy change. So we might want to consider funding mechanisms, what funding mechanisms are necessary in order to achieve equity within renewable energy distribution. And for example, general funding, annual appropriations. I don't know if that's appropriate for study.
Well, I did hear, I guess it was Peter Sterling, socializing the cost of net metering across the state. I don't know if you imagined that being part of this work when you were working on this.
I think that, Madam Chair, I think that there are, we can go in so many places down here.
Right.
And so, we've devised, that we've left that draft language open and kind of constrained the report. And it's 8 meetings.
Yeah.
So, and for those that are not familiar with these discussions, they're difficult because, we're trying to balance really, really important issues. So I would say less is more, the absolute necessary pieces only, and let the group do its best work, hopefully with good facilitation.
Representative Stebbins.
Thank you. 18 people is a lot. On the other hand, I don't know who you cut because each entity has a particularized interest.
My God.
There you go, Representative Morris. He's listening. Joke for you. And frankly, these people talk to each other a lot, most of them. So presumably they should, be able to have some pre-existing ways of communicating effectively with each other in a large setting, since many of them meet like once a month for the Vermont System Planning Committee. What I was going to say, and hopefully folks might be watching who are part of this bill, is it okay if I mentioned the piece that I would like to see added? I think you talked out of it, but I think it's important because it's actually a technical part of the piece, which is page 2. It says recommending cost-effective procurement policies to increase new renewable energy and storage to offset. What I would like to see is renewable energy, storage, flexible load management, and the integration of all three to offset increasing in-state load, yada, yada, yada. The reason why is because, what we're seeing more and more in the technology is that you have solar on a rooftop, you have an electric vehicle, and then you have the utility having a time of use rate that can pull and push power to the vehicle or to the storage unit within the house, within the structure. And so this is really, it's essentially like storage in the sense that it is how we connect these pieces, the solar or the whatever the renewable energy may be with the storage, with when the energy is needed.
Demand management.
So maybe for everybody watching it, there are heart attacks about it, they could communicate to me.
Just Representative Sabila.
So can we, I wonder about just adding flexible load management.
I guess how does that work? How does it fit in to the renewable energy standard? I mean, I know GMP is doing that already.
Well, it fits in because it makes the renewables that you're building far more effective. I mean, if as it was said, solar isn't generating at midnight, but if you have a vehicle to grid car that you can actually push and pull energy. I mean, that's to what TJ was saying. Other states have clean peak standards. This sort of gets at how do you use the solar that's generated as efficiently and effectively as possible related to when you need energy.
Yeah.
So it brings the value.
Representative Sabila.
May I just ask I think we have 3 of the utilities in the room. Do we see any big challenges with adding that language? Can we get that on the record?
Yes, there are two not. Lewis Porter.
Lewis Porter, Washington Electric Co-op. I think that's a good idea. No reason to constrain this group out of any of its tools. While I have the floor, very briefly, on the equity language, I think the net metering is technically outside the res. So I think what you're trying to get at would be energy procurement broadly or electrical procurement broadly, not just res. But thank you.
Dylan Zwicky.
Dylan Zwicky for Green Mountain Power. Share the thoughts just offered by Lewis
on the adding of flexible load management.
And also the net metering.
Member with Mayor Burlington Electric Department would be fine.
Great, thanks. Okay, members. Ellen.
So number 3 strikes me as it could be its own study committee.
I agree.
And then I wasn't sure if you had anyone testify today from the Climate Council. So I did just want to remind you that the Climate Action Plan does recommend going to 100% renewable. And so, I haven't spent a ton of time looking at this language, but it does. So 1 and 2 together ask whether any changes to the renewable energy requirements are needed, and then identifying barriers to going to 100% renewable. So perhaps that wouldn't be too much time out of the study committee's work, because it does suggest that it strikes me that some of that work has already been done by the Climate Council. But so just wanted to throw that out there, because it asks whether you should, but then also is going to 100, which was recommended in the Climate Action Plan. So
important point. Thoughts on that?
And I had one other thing. I think I sort of alluded to it, but there isn't any actual money in this. So it does reference an RFP for JFO to issue, and then there's also per diems, but there isn't an appropriation on it. So you may want to consider how much you think would be needed.
Yeah. Representative Torrey.
Question for you, with the addition of flexible load management, should we consider an additional member of the working group, the efficiency Vermont? I know you don't want more, but.
Representative Scalia.
So, Madam Chair, so I would envision that others would join this meeting. That others could join this meeting or certainly be brought in.
All right. Is there further discussion on this? Representative Bonner.
Minor, but I would suggest we do add net metering into place that Louis suggested we add it, just to make sure that doesn't get left on.
All right, members. Representative Scalia.
So I've taken some notes.
Yeah.
And we have.
Right, so we'll make some edits based on the testimony we took today and input from Representative Logan and Legislative Council. And plan will be to consider this amendment tomorrow, more or less when we get a chance. I mean, I think we're going to be, oh no, this is the one we're doing, S 112. We need to move quickly to get this out so that the bill can go make its way through the body. And so this afternoon, after 10 minutes after the floor, we're going to have Ellen back in on amendments on S 100 that we've been talking about. And right, thank you. We have scheduled a vote on S 137, the energy efficiency modernization. Today, this afternoon after the floor. Okay. With that, I think everyone should take a 10-minute break before the floor and go outside and get some oxygen for. We're adjourned for the